Buried inside the strange chemistry of the old alchemical texts is a principle that Carl Jung found himself returning to again and again throughout his career, both in his study of ancient manuscripts and in his own work with real, suffering patients. The alchemists were fascinated by a particular kind of substance, often connected to poisonous or dangerous materials like certain minerals or venomous creatures, which they believed, if properly and carefully prepared, could be transformed into the very medicine capable of curing the exact same kind of harm the raw substance would otherwise cause. The poison and the cure in this old understanding were never two separate things pulled from entirely different sources. They came from the very same root, and the entire skill of the alchemist lay in knowing how to transform one into the other without destroying the essential substance in the process. This idea reached back even further than the alchemists themselves, into an ancient tradition Jung studied closely, the figure of the wounded healer. In the oldest myths of many cultures, the god or hero who becomes capable of healing others is very often someone who has first suffered a wound of their own, sometimes a wound that never fully closes, that the healer carries with them for the rest of their life, even as they use their hard-won understanding to help others recover from similar suffering. Jung found this pattern too consistent across too many unrelated traditions to be a simple coincidence, and he came to believe it was pointing towards something genuinely true about how real healing, whether physical or psychological, actually tends to work. Consider, honestly, where the people who have genuinely helped you through your own most difficult times actually learned how to do it. Very rarely is it someone who has never struggled with anything remotely similar to what you are facing, offering advice from a position of complete and untouched comfort. Far more often, the people who truly understand how to sit with another person's pain, who know instinctively what to say and what to leave unsaid, who can offer genuine comfort rather than the hollow, textbook reassurance of someone reciting rules they learned secondhand, are people who have been through something painfully similar themselves. Their own wound, rather than disqualifying them from being helpful, turns out to be the very source of their capacity to genuinely help. They know the terrain because they have walked it themselves, and this hard-won, often costly knowledge cannot be faked or fully substituted by someone who has only studied the subject from the safety of the outside. Jung took this observation seriously in his own clinical philosophy, and it shaped how he thought about the entire practice of psychological healing in a way that was genuinely unusual for his time. Many of his contemporaries in the field of psychiatry treated the doctor as a purely objective, detached observer, someone standing entirely outside the patient's suffering, diagnosing and treating it from a position of complete professional distance. Jung came to believe this model, however scientifically respectable it sounded, missed something essential about how genuine healing actually happens between two people. He argued controversially for his era that a therapist who had never genuinely faced their own wounds, who remained entirely untouched and unchanged by the suffering they were supposedly treating in others, was actually poorly equipped for the deepest kind of healing work, precisely because they lacked the hard-won personal understanding that only comes from having faced something similar in their own life. This does not mean that suffering by itself automatically qualifies someone to help others, and it is important not to misunderstand this principle as a simple endorsement of unprocessed pain. The alchemists were very clear that the raw, untreated poisonous substance could not simply be handed to a patient as it was. It had to be carefully and skillfully transformed first, refined through a long and often difficult process before it became safe and effective as a medicine rather than remaining simply dangerous. The same is true of a person's own wounds. Someone who has suffered a great deal but has never done the difficult patient work of actually understanding and integrating that suffering often becomes, if anything, more dangerous to be around rather than more genuinely helpful, projecting their own unprocessed pain onto everyone they meet, mistaking their own unresolved wound for wisdom simply because it was hard won. The wound only becomes medicine after it has been carefully worked with, understood, and transformed, exactly as the alchemists insisted their dangerous raw materials had to be patiently refined before they could serve any healing purpose at all. This principle offers something genuinely important for how a person might think about their own difficult experiences, particularly the ones that still feel like open, unresolved wounds, rather than sources of any obvious wisdom or strength. It suggests that the goal is neither to pretend the wound never happened, covering it over with a falsely cheerful confidence that convinces no one, least of all yourself, nor to remain permanently stuck inside the raw and untreated pain of it, endlessly repeating the same unprocessed suffering without ever doing the harder work of actually understanding what it has to teach. The goal, according to this old alchemical wisdom, is the patient and often difficult labor of transformation, taking the raw and genuinely dangerous material of a real wound and slowly, carefully working with it until it becomes something that can actually be of use, both to yourself and eventually perhaps to others who are facing something similar. There is a particular comfort available in this principle for anyone who has ever felt that their own struggles somehow disqualified them from being genuinely useful or wise, as though only people who had lived easy, untroubled lives were qualified to offer anything of real value to others. The old tradition of the wounded healer suggests almost exactly the opposite. It is very often precisely the people who have faced the darkest and most difficult parts of their own experience and who have done the patient work of transforming that darkness rather than simply being destroyed by it, who end up possessing the deepest and most genuinely useful understanding available to offer anyone else. Your wound in this old understanding is not simply a liability to be hidden or overcome. It is, once properly worked with, a potential source of exactly the kind of hard-won wisdom that a life free of any real difficulty could never have produced. This is not a license to remain unhealed, believing that suffering by itself is automatically valuable, or that a wound left completely raw and untreated somehow makes a person wiser simply by virtue of having happened. The alchemists were entirely clear about the careful and patient work required to transform a poison into a medicine, and that work is genuinely difficult, often requiring years of honest self-examination, sometimes with real help from others, before the raw material of a wound actually becomes something capable of healing rather than simply continuing to harm. But it does suggest that the difficult experiences you carry, rather than being something to be endlessly ashamed of or hidden away, may in time, if patiently and honestly worked with, become the very source of a wisdom and a capacity for genuine compassion that an easier life could never have taught you. Think honestly about the wounds in your own life that you suspect have not yet been fully transformed, the ones that still feel raw rather than refined, and ask yourself whether the patient work of understanding and integrating them has genuinely been done, or whether they remain, for now, simply painful rather than yet useful. Both states are honest and both deserve compassion. The old tradition simply insists that the second state does not have to be permanent. If you have a wound in your own life that you suspect could eventually become a source of real understanding for yourself or for others, write below the single word for what that wound was about. Naming it honestly without either hiding it or claiming it has already been fully transformed is often the true beginning of the patient work the old alchemists insisted no shortcut could ever replace. Because the poisonous substances those old workers so carefully learned to transform in their laboratories were never really about medicine in the ordinary sense at all. They were a picture of the oldest and most hopeful truth healers of every tradition have ever discovered, that the very thing which wounds us most deeply, patiently and honestly worked with, can in time become exactly the medicine that finally heals.